Hi, everybody. It's Jeffrey Phillips. I'm back talking with Paul Hobcraft about something we both think is a vital topic in the area of innovation, and that's the linkage between corporate strategy and innovation. So, Paul, give us some thoughts initially about what you think about when you think about the link between innovation and strategy.
Jeffrey and I are going to have a group of conversations, and you will find within this group of conversations, we will emerge with a very clear framework. But the key to the conversation is very much what we think is the most important, which is strategy and innovation. The two things have to go together. They are linked. And I would call the word that we should be always thinking about, they need to be tightly linked, because innovation is really the momentum that can move you towards your goal and your vision, which is strategy. It is the growth and impact delivery mechanism. It is the objective of new business creation. So I think there is this incredible linkage that if you don't have innovation always within your framing of how you do innovation and think about it from a strategic point of view, you're going to have real problems. What do you feel, Jeffrey?
Well, I like especially the ideas of growth. The idea is that I think innovation is something that's going to introduce new growth, new products, new services, new business models. And when and where you don't see this linkage between innovation and strategy, I think innovation tends to run off the rails. It pursues activities or interests that aren't in alignment with innovation, and that becomes a problem for the corporation. So one of the things I'd love to talk to you about, Paul, is this idea of how might we frame innovation activities and link it to strategy. Do you have some ideas around things like, say, portfolios or horizons? I'm sort of setting you up with a softball here.
Yeah, no, I like it. Let me see if I can hit it somehow or other. There's a lot of ways you could bring innovation and strategy together, but both Jeffrey and I like very much something that's been around for a fair amount of time, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be followed. It shouldn't be understood, because they're both, we believe, extremely valuable. And the first one we want to talk about briefly is the three horizons. Do you want to introduce the three horizons, Jeffrey?
Yes, Paul. And what I'm going to do is actually share my screen. If everyone will give me a second, I'll share that. And Paul and I there's plenty of different versions of the three horizons. And Paul actually is the person who introduced me to this. But the idea being that across the bottom there, you can see sort of near term, further out, and future. And on the other side, you can see prevalence. Then there's plenty of different ways to look at this. But ultimately, the three horizons is the idea of what are you working on that drives revenue and value today? What are the things that are going to drive revenue or value tomorrow? And what are the things that are going to be more essential in the future? And the idea here is that you should be innovating across these three horizons. You should be thinking about your strategy across these three horizons. And that's why this idea of the three horizons makes a really natural linkage and tie for both innovation and strategy. How'd I do, Paul?
Yeah, good, because strategy isn't tied to a specific time. Strategy needs to embrace across different times. So the reason why we like the three horizon practice, and if you look at this particular one that Jeffrey is showing, if you notice number one, number two, number three, they're in completely different places. We are really saying there is a present system, the transitional zone that you need to go through towards your future system you wish to achieve. So you would be looking in your present system as present concerns. Then you would be saying, well, okay, that's my concerns, but what are my aspirations? What are the things I want to achieve? That's your future system working and framing. And then in between, you're going to say, well, what is it that's going to inspire me to maintain my present business? What is it that's going to drive me to my future business? So that's number three. And number four is, what is it from a strategic point of view that I've learned from this that becomes then, what innovations do I need to bring into play? What do I need to actually think about to say, this looks after my today business. This is beginning to build me towards my future business. And then most important, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You actually know there's a lot of good stuff within your current company, core, essential. You need to transform from and to. So you have to say, well, what is it that's essential to keep besides people, systems, what type of sort of growth activities? So I think the Three Horizons practice is a fantastic mechanism to be able to walk through how strategy and how innovation interlinks. You got any more thoughts, Jeffrey?
I'm going to end the share here and come back and talk not only just about the Three Horizons and a way to think about what we're doing today, what we want to do tomorrow, and then what we want to do in the future. And then link that to the idea and take it further and talk about the idea of, if we think about those Three Horizons, let's think about them as portfolios. Because the way we think about products in portfolios, we want to think about ideas and strategies in portfolios. And if we continue to this idea of that strategy and innovation are linked and tied together and they flow together, and we would definitely tie our strategies into portfolios, and we should tie our innovations into portfolios. So one of the really interesting questions to be asking is, if you have a link between innovation and strategy, how might you think about your innovation and your innovation work in a series of portfolios? How am I doing, Paul?
I mean, it's not just work, but it's funding. And the two things combined together. So there is a rule of thumb that I personally do not subscribe to, which is a 70-20-10. So it says, put 70% of your work, 70% of your funds into the present,
right?
Put 20% into your transformation and 10% into your future. To be honest, I think that's as out of date and as old fashioned as you can get for the majority of businesses, unless they're slow moving, rather boring, old fashioned sunset industries, then it's a different thing. To be honest, many startups, many technology companies, many healthcare centers, many places that are building or wanting to build new business models should be flipping that. They should be saying, I'm going to keep 10, maybe 20% in my existing business, and I'm going to be putting the majority, 60, 70% in my future business. Now, to get to that 60, 70%, it could well be I peel off 10, 20 of that and put it in my middle, because my middle is doing two things. It's keeping my business going, but it's also building my capabilities and capacity for my future. So the more money you put into building new capacity, new competencies, the more it's going to get you closer to your future. So that 70-20-10 rule, in which people often fall into the trap of, question very carefully and say, does it actually link innovation and strategy together? And to be honest, I don't think it does. But what do you feel, Jeffrey?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you mentioned I'd love to bounce off. And number one is 70-20-10 is a rule of thumb. And unless you go around measuring everything with your thumb, and you view that as a distinct way of measuring things, then you should realize that 70-20-10 is really just an entry point to then be much more, and I'm going to use a word here that's overused, but I think it's very important here, to be intentional. What I mean by that is, I think a lot of innovation investment is accidental, or it's driven by the spur of the moment. What we should be doing is planning these investments strategically across these three horizons. And therefore, we should be able to look at a portfolio at any time and say, good, we have 40% of our investment in incremental, 40% in this transition state, and 20%. And we should be able to measure at any time all of our strategies and all of our innovation investments in that way. And if I can do that, then I've demonstrated that my strategy and my innovations, those are tightly linked, not only in terms of what activities I'm doing, but what investments, and also across what horizons. And unless and until you reach that point, you don't have a really tight linkage between innovation and strategy, in my opinion.
And I'd like to build on that as well, if I may, because if you're going to have a strategy, I mean, a real strategy that has clear horizons over present, middle, and long term, what you're really building and what you need is a sustaining innovation set of activities, and you need a systematic way of approaching it. It doesn't necessarily mean it always has to be the same process and the same way you go through your innovation activities, but you do have to have some system in place, some recognition, some and we will talk about this on another series, common language, for example, where you've got to really understand. So strategy and innovation has to be both sustaining, and it has to also be systematic, because in the end, Clayton Christensen, who is a very famous man from an innovation perspective, said, innovation isn't random. And it's true. If you make it random, you're all over the map. It's like starting off somewhere where you haven't got a compass or you haven't got a GPS point. You don't know where you are. You don't know where you're going to end up. You really got to have a very clear set of guidelines and frameworks. And from our point of view, what strategy and innovation does together, it introduces an overarching strategic design.
Yeah, and I'd like to sort of wrap this conversation up by saying we've talked today about how we believe how tightly necessary it is for strategy and innovation to be linked together and to be influencing each other. And Paul talked about other kinds of formats and frameworks. And I'd like to spend just a moment talking about this particular format and framework, which Paul and I developed, called the work mat. And you'll see at the top the chess piece that's sort of indicative of this idea of strategy. And through the next set of conversations, we're going to be talking about some of these other features. And Paul talked about that middle column there with the two call-out bubbles, which is common language. But what we are getting at with this work mat is the idea that there are a set of factors or features in your business that need to be considered as a cohesive whole in order to do innovation and strategy well together, and to be able to build what I would call an innovation environment in your business. So this is something we'll be looking at over the next few conversations. We call this the executive work mat. And this is one of those other frameworks that Paul was talking about that are important to the success of both your innovation capability and in turn, the strategy of your business. So Paul, let's wrap up and talk about innovation and strategy. What more would you like to say?
I will, but just flip back to that chart, just if you could for 1 second, please, Jeffrey, because I'd like to bring up to people what this visualization is. It isn't a COVID one. In other, if you walk around this, you could actually say, oh, there's your DNA. It's a worldwide phenomena. We need to unlock it. The key. The government needs to get involved, and it's going to cost us a lot of money, and we need a lot of chess pieces. No, it is not a Corvette framework. This is an innovation executive work mat framework. I was just smiling when Jeffrey put this up, because I thought this is really good actually to make it a Corvette framework. But Jeffrey, I'm getting onto the side. Let's get back to strategy and alignment.
All right. So hopefully in this conversation, we've talked a little bit about what we think about in terms of innovation and strategy and their linkages. And for us, this is the sort of one of the core pieces of what we think of as the work mat. And we will be exploring some other components of the work mat in subsequent conversations. We've talked a little bit about the need for tight linkage between strategy and innovation. We've talked about the idea of the three horizons and also thinking about it as an intentional portfolio. Paul, any last takeaways?
Yeah, I've got 4 or 5 thoughts that people have to think about. Today, if you don't have strategy aligned with your innovation, we're in a different world than where we were even 2 years ago, 5 years ago. We're in a very uncertain environment. So if you don't get linkage, you're going to have problems. Secondly, it's far more disruptive. So one of the best anchor points is to actually have your strategy and innovation tightly linked, because it will be less disruptive from the points of not knowing where you're going. Thirdly, we're in a completely different time than we ever were, in scale, in speed, in whatever. And there's a technology linkage that's coming far more in place today. So our strategic alignment is so much more important today from an innovation perspective than it was. That's my sort of final point, Jeffrey.
Well, I think you've made a couple of really interesting points there. I especially like the idea of, with so much uncertainty in the marketplace, how might we create more certainty within the business? And the more certainty we can create, the more definitive we can take action. And the way to create more certainty in the business is to lay out strategies and plans that people can understand. And as we start linking innovation and strategy together and make it more clarified and even more intentional, then I think it'll be able to execute more effectively, even though there's uncertainty out in the environment itself.
I agree with you. I agree.
All right, so we'll ask you to tune in on some of our subsequent conversations. We're going to be talking about common language. We're going to be talking about governance and some other aspects of the work mat, and we'll be featuring the work mat throughout some of those conversations. For now, thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Take care. Good conversation. Bye.